Welcome back, everyone. So, including this week, we have only 3 weeks left through the end of the semester because next week you're going to be on Thanksgiving break. And then when you return, you have only 2 more weeks of class. So, before we even begin, I want to take a moment and have you guys think about just the tremendous amount of work that you've done this semester. You should be proud of yourselves. I also wanted to mention a housekeeping item, which is that I'm going to be returning your papers throughout this week and early next week. You have my apologies for the delay in returning your papers. I teach 3 courses, and in total, I teach 70 students this semester. In addition to that, I do quite a bit of university service, and I simply have just had a backlog of grading. So, to give you a sense of the kind of grading that I do on any given week, I am grading nearly 220 different projects. So, you have my apologies about the delay. I'm very much looking forward to reading your papers. All right. So, I want to begin our content lecture this week on the authors that we're reading. Now, last week we examined the work of Zora Neale Hurston. Hurston, if you'll recall, is an African American female writer and a member of the Harlem Renaissance. You noted in the discussion board that Hurston's writing just engrossed you into the world of her characters, with the result that you really felt you got a sort of window onto the experience of being an African American living in a rural small town in Florida in the early 1920s. Now, you felt that in Hurston's story, race was an important element, but it wasn't the sole focus. And that makes sense. After all, we learned last week that Hurston's goal as a writer was to create African American characters who were complex. That is, characters she didn't want to create characters who were either stereotypes or only meant to represent race. Rather, she wanted to create characters who were extremely complex and who were dealing with struggles that many people face, like heartbreak or marriage problems or self discovery. Now, this week we're going to be reading 2 more African American authors, Richard Wright and Alice Walker. Um, and these authors are also 20th century African American authors like Hurston, and through them, I want to continue our discussion of the way in which African American writers in the 20th century represent race in the context of other struggles. So, as a sort of general note, as a reader, we can use sort of cultural elements as a kind of lens through which to read works. For example, if we wanted to, we could examine a work through the lens of gender, and that would enable us to understand how a given story comments upon the experience of gender, of being either a man or a woman in a particular society. And we did this when we read Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. We examined that novel through the lens of gender. However, we don't have to explore literature through one lens only. We can actually examine literature through, let's say, 2 lenses, 2 cultural lenses. And doing so will allow for a more complicated reading of that work of literature. So, for example, we could examine a work of literature through the lens of, let's say, gender or race, or gender and race. And this double approach allows for a much richer exploration because it takes into account the fact that identity categories and identity experiences don't occur in a vacuum. They interact with one another. So, this video is intended to give you some background information on Richard Wright, who is the first author that we're reading this week. Now, Wright is one of the great American authors of the 20th century. He was absolutely prolific in terms of his literary output. He wrote novels and poetry, drama, short stories, autobiographies, histories, and essays. He's most known for 2 works, Native Son and Black Boy. But these were only 2 works within a vast and absolutely fascinating literary corpus, because he was ultimately not just a literary author, he was also a public intellectual. He encouraged American audiences to confront the realities of what it was like to be Black in America by writing about the educational, racial, economic, and social oppression that African Americans experienced. And his work ultimately authored a scathing indictment of racism in America. But this wasn't the only thing that he wrote about. He also traveled around the world in order to raise awareness worldwide about the oppression of people living in third world countries. So here's some biographical information on him. Wright was born in 1908 on a plantation in Mississippi. His father was a sharecropper. Now, a sharecropper is a farmer who basically rents his land from a landowner, from usually a larger plantation, and then he pays the rent, usually in crops. And it's kind of a form of feudalism. And it was actually quite common among African Americans living in the rural South in the later 19th and 20th centuries. African American farmers oftentimes couldn't afford to own land, so they ended up just continuing to labor for white landowners, paying them with their crops. And typically, sharecroppers lived in really great poverty. And this was absolutely the early experience of the Wright family. Wright's father was quite poor. He didn't make very much money from being a sharecropper. Wright's childhood was ultimately marked by instability, as well as economic, familial, educational, and racial hardships. When he was 3 years old, his family decided to move the family to Memphis, Tennessee for better economic opportunities. But when they arrived, he ended up abandoning his family. Wright's mother was unable to support Wright and her and his brother, working menial jobs. So she moved the family to Arkansas to live with her sister and brother-in-law. But shortly after arriving in Arkansas, her brother-in-law was murdered by white men who coveted his property, and the Wright family had to flee. His mother then later had a stroke and became disabled. Wright moved around a good bit in his childhood and eventually decided to settle in Jackson, Mississippi, and live with his grandmother. Wright moved to Chicago in 1937, where he began writing, and he also joined the Communist Party. And although he remained interested in the communist ethos for most of his adult life, he broke with the Chicago Communist Party and in 1937 moved to New York City. And it's really in New York City that his writing career takes off. In 1938, he published a collection of novellas called Uncle Tom's Children, which was very well received critically and which sold quite well. And in 1939, he received a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship, which enabled him to complete Native Son, a novel that was published in 1940. Native Son was profoundly successful. It was incredibly well received critically, and it sold almost 200,000 copies in 3 weeks. This success was then outdone in 1945 with the publication of Black Boy, Richard Wright's autobiographical account of his own childhood. That work sold almost 400,000 copies. Following the publication of Black Boy, Wright went on a national tour giving lectures, and then a European tour to give lectures as well. He returned from his European tour in 1947, but once he got back to New York City, Wright felt that he just couldn't continue to work and live among the rampant racism in the United States. And so he moved with his wife and his child to France, where they became permanent residents until his death. While in France, Wright became interested in Africa. He toured what is today Ghana by way of the Canary Islands in order to better understand the conditions of Africans living in nations with colonial pasts. And this tour produced a work of nonfiction called Black Power, which was very widely and critically received. Wright continued to lecture and write throughout the rest of his life, exploring in his work pathways from bondage to freedom, both in the United States and also abroad. He died of a heart attack in 1960. Now, 2 months after his death, his work, Eight Men, was published. This is a collection of short stories, and it's from this collection that the story that we're reading today was taken. So The Man Who Was Almost a Man, the story that we read, was written in the 1930s, and it details the experience of Dave Saunders. Dave is a 17-year-old African-American teenager living in the rural South, and he longs to purchase a revolver as he thinks that other people will recognize him as a man if he owns a gun. After he purchases the gun, he takes it out into the fields to try it out, and he ends up accidentally shooting the mule that he's taken with him, which belongs to the farmer that he works for. Now, Wright is what we call a naturalistic writer. In fact, he's one of the great naturalistic writers of America. This means two things. His writing relies heavily upon realistic details, and his writing reflects his belief that family, society, and environment shape characters' decisions. So, in this sense, a character's responses to the world around him are predetermined by the social conditioning of his environment. So, as you think about this story, I want you to think about how Dave's environment, his family, and the society he live in shape his desire for a gun, and also his faith that a gun will enable him to be recognized as a man by other people. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to discussing this work with you.